Naturally, it is a threat to Russia if he says that we are a threat. If they announce a meeting of the heads of general quarters of the European countries and the United Kingdom, if they say that they need to use their nuclear weapons or prepare to use nuclear weapons against Russia, this is naturally a threat for us. Unlike his predecessors, who also wanted to wage war on Russia, like Napoleon or Hitler, Mr. Macron isn't being very elegant in his actions. His predecessors stated openly that they want to conquer, to defeat Russia. President Macron obviously wants the same, but for some reason he says that Russia shouldn't defeat France. He says that Russia is a threat to Europe. From time to time, President Macron proudly says that he would call President Putin and he would talk to him. But he has such an opportunity, the line is open, and the President always emphasizes his openness to contacts and dialogue to all his counterparts. And speaking of these unreasonable accusations of Russia that we are preparing for war against Europe and France, President Putin has said many times that this is absolute nonsense. And I think that any reasonable person would understand that Russia doesn't want any war. Russia wants to eliminate the root causes of the situation created by the West in Ukraine in order to suppress the influence and essentially to wage war against Russia. First of all, we're talking about the NATO expansion, and now President Trump and his team clearly understand that this was the root cause for the conflict, and this is openly stated. While the Europeans, who for some reason decided that the United States has betrayed their interests, and now the Europeans simply prefer to ignore the root causes and the topic of NATO, and instead they are trying to create new coalitions within NATO, and essentially they're creating fighting forces within NATO to be deployed in the territory of Ukraine.
One more root cause, which is mentioned all the time, is that at the legal level they are exterminating the Russian language, the Russian media, the canonic Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They banned all of it. None in the West has said anything about this, but on the contrary, on any other occasion, they are very vocal. They put a premium on the human rights. Just recently, they held some event between the European Union and Asian states, and they discussed almost only human rights. No one prohibits to speak any language, Russian or French, in Central Asia, but they did it in Ukraine. And the officials from Zelensky office, they say that they have the open democracy, the more open democracy than anywhere in the world, and Europe is silent about all of this. It is strange to me hear Mr. Macron saying so aggressively that he pursues the undertakings of Napoleon, who was going to conquer Russia. But when covering his true intentions, he started criticizing President Putin for telling lies all the time, thus launching the indirect dialogue with President Trump. President Trump said clearly that everything he had agreed upon with President Putin was fulfilled, and Macron chose the way of Zelensky in the Oval Office. He mentioned that allegedly Putin undermined some agreements 25 times. These are the words of a person who came to power under a slogan of establishing peace and respect of the Minsk agreements, and later he said he was never going to implement them. Macron also mentioned that Putin repeatedly violated any agreements reached, and it turns out that his accusation, this condemnation, refers to the meeting in Paris organized by Macron in December 2019, the meeting of the Normand Four with Macron, Merkel, Zelensky, and Putin. It was December 2019, and this meeting was aimed at saving the Minsk agreements. And back then, when organizing this event in December, at the level of experts, at the level of ministers, we completely agreed on the basis of a consensus the final documents. Point 1 was about the following. We agree on the need to withdraw the troops from the contact line all along this contact line, and this document was agreed upon. When the leaders came to the negotiations and they were looking through the documents agreed upon by experts and ministers, Zelensky said that he was not going to implement this, that he was not going to withdraw the troops along the contact line, because this contact line would become the border forever. This is how he treated the Minsk agreements. He said, I can only withdraw the troops in 3 points along the contact line, and Ukrainian representatives indicated the 3 points. Eventually, they had to agree on this, to agree to this. However, both Macron and Merkel were unpleasantly surprised. The capabilities of this person to abuse hospitality are well known. Taking a retrospective look, I would like to add something. In none of these 3 points indicated by Zelensky as the points where the troops could be withdrawn, nothing was done. Ukraine undermined this agreement. Speaking about the political part of the document, which was adopted in Paris, this document reaffirmed the provisions spelled out in the Minsk agreements, the need to enshrine constitutionally and legally the special status of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics while making a corresponding amendment to the constitution. This was all spelled out in this document. And a few days later, everyone realized Zelensky was not going to implement any of this. You can find some materials showing that after this summit in Paris in December 2019, the 4 leaders were sitting at the same table. Everyone could see the face and the emotions of President Zelensky during the speech of President Putin, thus demonstrating his attitude to the document which has already been signed. And now, when making his lofty statements, he says that it was Russia who was unwilling to implement the agreements, and the fact that Macron and Merkel in December 2019 in Paris spoke about the need of saving the Minsk agreements. It was a lie as well. After this summit, Hollande, who signed these agreements, and Merkel herself said that they were not going to sign anything. They were willing to buy some time to pour more arms into Ukraine. Initially, they were calling upon saving the Minsk agreements. The naive attitude is not welcomed in international politics, and we are not going to practice it any longer. Final question, BBC. Thank you very much.
Sergei Viktorovich, в Европе продолжает обсуждать.
Minister Lavrov, Europe discusses sending peacekeepers to Ukraine. Is Moscow against this? Or is there a room for the compromise? We see no room for a compromise. This discussion is carried out with an overtly hostile objective. They never concealed why they needed this. Macron, with the support of Mr. Starmer, as far as I know, they are going to bring Zelensky to Washington. And Macron and Starmer, as they describe their plan, they believe that hostilities should be ceased for 1 month. And when it comes to energy facilities, and within this period, they should deploy these troops there. And the conditions for peace agreements should be considered simultaneously. If one deployed troops on a given territory, perhaps you won't be willing to come to terms on some conditions because you have concrete facts on the ground. Second, when these issues were touched upon, for instance, the Trump administration, when answering to the questions of mass media, they said that such things, such actions, if they are going to call them the peacekeeping forces, should be agreed by both sides. Neither Macron nor Starmer, proponents of deploying troops in Ukraine, they never mentioned this. We will consider the presence of these troops on the Ukrainian territory as we did in the case with a potential NATO presence on the Ukrainian territory, no matter how well they cover and what flags they used, the NATO, the European Union, no matter whose soldiers are there, and no matter what insignia they put on the sleeves of their military uniform. In any case, these will be the NATO soldiers. Ireland, for some reason, expressed its readiness to send its military contingency to Ukraine. Canada, Australia, they are also ready. A very interesting company is being assembled. It is our principled position that we are not going to observe these actions because this would mean, let me reiterate, not the allegedly hybrid involvement, but the direct and open, overt involvement of the NATO member states into a war against the Russian Federation. We cannot allow this happen. And against this backdrop, against the nervous statement made by Macron that Russia is a threat to Europe, and if it is so, that troops should be sent. My last point. From day one of the special military operation, when the negotiations in Belarus took place in 2022 and later in Istanbul, they almost came to terms and they initialed the document, which was later banned from fulfillment by Boris Johnson, and Zelensky agreed to that. Macron says all the time that any negotiations are impossible without Ukraine, that Russia and the United States will come to terms and Ukraine and Europe would be sidelined. Nothing can be done about Ukraine without Ukraine. But all these forums which are being mainstreamed by the West in order to discuss either the Zelensky peace formula or the victory formula. Now he has come up with some kind of a new initiative. Naturally, they were speaking about Russia without Russia. This is the case of a colonial and neo-colonial mentality. It is a rude behavior, after all, and they believe that this is a normal way of conduct. No one can say anything about Ukraine without Ukraine, but it doesn't work with Russia. Both Macron and Starmer were bragging about their potential draft documents they would explain to Zelensky, and later they will come to Trump to approve this document, and all these projects would be presented to Putin later. From the rules of behavior, from the diplomatic rules of behavior, it's not a good thing to do. I understand quite well that real diplomacy and any rules of appropriate behavior, they have been trampled upon by the West long ago, and that is why there is nothing surprising about such a stance. Nevertheless, I hear some reasonable people speaking, including within the NATO, within the European Union. They understand quite well that in order to save their reputation, Macron, which is lost within France, and he can make some reckless actions.